Would you believe a dog drifted 200 miles into open ocean? Alone in a lifeboat? With nothing but a soaked wooden floor and a silent message hidden beneath his paws? And somehow, that silent stare up at the helicopter changed everything for the Navy, for a grieving family, and for the world watching later who couldn't stop asking themselves, how did he survive? And what exactly did he know that no one else did, because what began as a routine rescue turned into a mystery that shook the crew, challenged logic, and reminded us that some bonds go beyond words, beyond species, and even beyond death. And it all started with a quiet boy named Caleb, just 8 years old, who lived in a modest blue house on the outskirts of Wilmington, North Carolina, a boy who didn't talk much, who was born with a speech delay and anxiety so deep that most of his communication came through eye contact and small gestures. A boy who had tried therapy and medication and everything his single mother could manage, until one summer morning a neighbor's dog wandered onto their porch. A large German shepherd with a scar across his right eye and fur that looked too old for his body, and Caleb had simply walked over, touched the dog's shoulder, and whispered the word safe. And from that day on, the two were inseparable. The dog, later named Odin, followed Caleb everywhere, stood between him and loud noises, barked when strangers came too close, and slept curled up against the boy's legs every night, breathing in sync, like their hearts had found a rhythm the world never gave them. And for the first time, Caleb smiled when he heard birds in the morning. He nodded when his mother asked if he was okay, and he even waved back at the crossing guard near school. And everyone began to notice, even the teachers, that this boy who had once trembled under fluorescent lights now stood taller when Odin was near. And life, for the first time in years, felt warm again. Until one August afternoon when Caleb's uncle, a retired Navy officer named Jordan, invited them on a short trip out to sea on his small fishing boat. A gesture meant to celebrate Caleb's 9th birthday, nothing extreme, just a quiet 2-day cruise on calm waters with fishing rods and soft music. A weekend they'd all remember, or so they thought. Because no one expected the storm, it wasn't even forecasted. A rogue squall that came in like a whisper at first, with a shift in the wind and a flicker in the waves. And Jordan, who had seen storms before, wasn't worried until the sky turned from gray to black in under 3 minutes. And the waves rose like mountains, tossing the boat like a toy in a bathtub, and panic set in, because they weren't close to shore anymore. They drifted farther than planned. And Caleb's mother clutched her son. Odin growled low and braced himself. And Jordan tried desperately to turn the boat around, but the rudder had snapped, and in the chaos, as thunder cracked and rain came down sideways, a rogue wave slammed into them from the starboard side, flipping the vessel, scattering gear, snapping metal, and sending all of them into the icy Atlantic water. The kind of cold that takes your breath away before you can even scream, and in that blur of darkness and salt and sound, the last thing anyone remembered was Odin barking, not just barking, but howling with a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than his chest. A sound that felt like it carried a message, a warning, and maybe even a promise. Because when the Coast Guard arrived 2 days later, after a weak distress signal had been picked up from Jordan's boat, they found no one, just shattered wood, a cooler, a child's life jacket, and a single torn photograph of Caleb and Odin taped to a thermos. And for the next 4 days, the search expanded. Aircraft scanned the ocean, rescue boats combed every visible patch of sea, but the trail went cold until the 6th day, when a cargo ship captain radioed in a strange sighting, a lifeboat drifting alone near the edge of their route. Too small for humans, too far from any wreckage, and yet inside it stood a soaking wet German shepherd, alert, growling at the skies, and refusing to sit, even as the waves jostled the boat. And when the Navy dispatched a rescue chopper unsure what they were looking at the moment the pilot saw the dog, he said later his hands shook, because something in that dog's eyes didn't look wild or panicked, they looked patient, almost like he was waiting for someone. And as they lowered the rope ladder and hovered above, the dog didn't flinch. He just stared up with those dark storm-soaked eyes and barked once, sharp, direct, like a signal. And what happened next? What they found underneath him? What was tied to his collar? And what was hidden in the lifeboat floorboards would unravel a truth that had been drifting silently across the ocean, guarding not just a secret, but perhaps the only surviving witness of a tragedy that was never supposed to happen. And before we go further, I just want to ask you, if you're watching this right now, where are you watching from and what time is it over there? Because this story, this dog, and this boy's silent bond will take us across oceans, into sealed Navy records, and into the kind of love that doesn't need words to be real. Because, in the end, some dogs don't just follow their humans. They protect their stories, even when everyone else has given up hope. The moment Odin was airlifted from the lifeboat, soaked to the bone but never once breaking his gaze from the baby bundled beneath his side. The Navy crew on board the helicopter knew this was not a standard rescue, and they treated it with the kind of care usually reserved for fragile black box recoveries or higher-risk human extractions. With silent focus and wide eyes, because Odin didn't act like a dog who had barely survived 6 days alone at sea. He acted like a soldier still on duty, guarding something sacred. And as they gently unwrapped the soaked thermal blanket from the infant's body, the crew medic nearly dropped her stethoscope because not only was the baby breathing shallow, yes, but steady, but she was clutching something in her tiny fist. A necklace tangled and frayed, with a nameplate that read Caleb. The same name printed on the missing person alert from North Carolina just days earlier. And even more shocking, wrapped in plastic beneath the baby's legs, was a USB drive. Dry and sealed, tagged with naval-grade paracord that no one could explain. And when they asked where the lifeboat came from, there was no record of its serial number. No vessel reported missing that matched its description, and the more questions they asked, the quieter the room grew until one officer finally said, "Get them to Base 7 now," and just like that, Odin and the infant were rerouted mid-flight to a restricted coastal outpost in Virginia, where the military quietly handles rescues. That can't be explained by paperwork alone, and as the helicopter blades slowed, and the crew stepped into the receiving bay with the baby still wrapped in Odin's watchful stare, a woman in a long gray coat stepped forward, not wearing rank insignia, but clearly in charge. She knelt down, not to the medic, not to the baby, but to the dog, and whispered, "Where's the boy?" And for the first time, Odin whimpered, low and aching, nudged the woman's wrists with his nose, and over the next 48 hours, what unfolded behind those secured walls began unraveling the kind of story no one was ready for, because the baby's DNA was quickly confirmed to match a missing Navy technician named Alana Griggs, reported lost at sea 3 years prior with her infant son. Presumed dead when her research vessel was found capsized during a violent cyclone, but here was her daughter, alive, hidden, protected, wearing a necklace with Caleb's name, and escorted by a dog that wasn't even assigned to the case. When they scanned Odin's microchip, they discovered his registry had been deactivated. Marked retired from service 5 years ago after a traumatic injury that left him unfit for duty, and yet here he was, alive, active, surviving impossible odds, and bringing with him a child who shouldn't even exist, and a flash drive filled with encrypted files bearing the markings of a defunct naval research project no one had clearance to access. And in the days that followed, while Caleb's grieving mother, who had buried an empty casket just a week ago, was flown in under the pretense of a miracle rescue, Odin stayed curled up by the child's side, refusing food, ignoring commands, responding only when the baby stirred or whimpered, as if his entire body existed only to ensure she remained safe. And when the woman in gray finally decrypted the files, what she found raised alarms that echoed all the way to D.C. Because it wasn't just navigational logs or project blueprints, it was video, grainy at first, then clear, showing the inside of the fishing boat that day, showing Caleb sitting beside Odin, showing Alana, the presumed dead technician, handing the baby to the dog with shaking hands, whispering something inaudible, and then frame by frame, it showed the wave coming. It showed Alana shielding the baby. It showed Odin dragging the lifeboat rope between his teeth. It showed him pulling, climbing, sheltering her. And most chillingly, it showed a time stamp that didn't match the official date of the accident. It was logged 2 days after the Coast Guard declared the family dead, which meant someone had covered something up. And the only witness who had been there from the start, the only being who saw everything, who carried the weight of that truth across 200 miles of salt and sky, was the German shepherd now sleeping beneath a heat lamp beside a baby girl who had no idea the world was spinning because of her. And when the media finally got a whiff of the rescue, the headlines went wild. Miracle dog saves baby at sea. Navy can't explain lifeboat origins. German shepherd guards infant for days. But even those stories couldn't capture the eerie calm of that lifeboat. The way Odin never barked for help, only watched, only waited, as if he knew help was coming, and he just had to keep her alive until it did. And back at the base, the woman in gray made one final call to a retired captain who answered on the first ring, and she said only one thing: "It's Odin. He brought her back." But the boy is still missing, and on the other end, the line went silent, because no one had mentioned a boy. And yet the voice replied, "Then we keep looking, somewhere miles from shore, deep beneath the weight of a past that had been buried too long, the truth was beginning to surface." And Odin, tired, battered, but still alert, lifted his head one last time that night. Eyes locked on the door as if he knew the story wasn't over. Not yet, not until they found the boy. While the outside world tried to catch up with the fragments of the story that had begun leaking through, small-town radio interviews, blurry satellite images, and shaky Navy statements about an ongoing internal investigation, something far deeper, had already begun shifting behind closed doors. Because Odin's return and the child he had protected had not just triggered awe. It had reopened files that had been intentionally buried, encrypted, and misfiled by people who no longer worked in the positions they once held. And somewhere, in a quiet office tucked away inside the Pentagon, an analyst named Mira Sandoval pulled up a file from a redacted hard drive. And as she scrolled through old logs, camera feeds, and handwritten notes, she saw something that made her stop breathing for a moment. A note scribbled by a junior officer, dated exactly 3 years prior. The same week, Alana Griggs and her baby had been declared lost at sea, and it read simply, "Odin reassigned without clearance. Claims dog sensed anomaly. Subject infant not stable. Caleb missing. No recovery ordered." And beside that note was a grainy photo of Odin pacing a steel hallway. Muzzle removed, vest off, eyes wild, not like a dog gone rogue, but like one trying to communicate something his human handlers were too deaf to hear. And Mira, who had no prior link to the case, who had never met anyone involved, felt something primal twist in her stomach. And she whispered aloud to no one. They never looked for him, and across the country. In a rehabilitation center disguised as a canine retirement sanctuary in Utah, an old trainer named Ren, who once worked with Odin during his recovery from spinal trauma, received a letter with no return address. Just a single photograph inside, of Odin inside the helicopter, eyes alert, tongue dry, a baby asleep on a medic's lap beside him. And Ren knew instantly what he was looking at, because the last time he saw Odin's eyes like that was the day the dog refused to leave a training pen after hearing a recording of a baby's cry. Even though there were no infants nearby, and that night Ren booked a one-way ticket east, telling no one where he was going. Because something in him said Odin hadn't just returned to save a life, he'd returned to finish what he started. And meanwhile, at the base in Virginia, the baby, named Isla by the medics until confirmation came, was steadily improving. Small hands twitching, eyes occasionally fluttering open, and Odin never left her side. Not for food, not for rest. Not even when they moved her into a sterile pediatric unit with beeping monitors and quiet nurses. He simply sat, tail curled tight around his paws, eyes fixed on the glass door, as if expecting someone to walk in. And it was there that Emily, Caleb's cousin, arrived with her father Ben, after the Navy reached out with a strange request for a DNA swab. And when Emily saw the baby, she dropped to her knees, tears flooding her face, because she said she knew, without question, that the baby had the same eyes as her Aunt Alana. And she whispered, "She's family." And Odin, watching from the Corner let out a low sigh that made the entire room freeze, because it wasn't just relief. It sounded like acknowledgement, like a silent confirmation. And yet, even with Isla safe, the tension only grew because Odin was beginning to show signs of collapsed kidney stress, dehydration, torn paw pads, internal bruising, and despite IV fluids and soft beds, he refused to lay down, refused to sleep, and the vet said quietly, "He's waiting for someone." And that's when Emily, who hadn't spoken much since the storm that took Max from her life, walked up to Odin, knelt beside him, and said softly, "You found her. Please let us help you now." And Odin leaned into her hand for just a second before turning his head sharply toward the wall, where the hallway met a secured door, and at that exact moment, Mira, the analyst, arrived with a single printed satellite image, not from this week, not from the original wreck, but from 2 days ago, showing a new lifeboat signal, pinging from just north of Bermuda, drifting aimlessly, and she laid it on the table beside Commander Ellis, who had been overseeing Odin's recovery, and said, "There's another one. Identical specs, no registration." This signal didn't come from ocean drift. It came from activation, and when the room went still, Mira added, "I think the boy's alive," and Odin, still standing in the medical room, let out one soft bark, the first real sound in days. And everyone who heard it swore later it didn't sound like a dog. It sounded like someone calling for a door to be opened. And within 6 hours, the Navy launched a second search, quieter. This time, without press, using unmarked drones and encrypted channels. And aboard one of those search vessels, Emily was invited to join, not just because she had family ties, but because Odin wouldn't board without her, and the crew, skeptical but out of options, allowed it, and as they neared the coordinates, Emily held on to Odin's harness and whispered, "If you're right, if he's still out there, we're not leaving without him." And Odin didn't bark this time. He just stared into the wind, ears pulled forward, body leaning toward something invisible just over the horizon. And back at the base, Isla stirred, opening her eyes fully, for the first time, and reached toward the ceiling with a hand that clutched nothing but air, while the baby monitor let out a strange, irregular pulse, almost like static. And the nurse, watching, blinked, rubbed her eyes, and whispered, "That's not a heartbeat monitor," and on the ocean. Just as the sun began to set, the radar picked up a shape not large, not fast, but constant, drifting gently in the same circular pattern it had held for the past 3 days. And Odin stood at the bow, unmoving, tail low, gaze locked, and everyone on board felt it before they saw it. The moment the wind changed. The moment the world seemed to hold its breath, because ahead of them was the second lifeboat, almost identical to the one Odin had been found in. And as they drew closer, a shape rose inside, small, upright, clutching something, and before anyone could speak, Odin howled, not with fear, not with pain, but with the kind of sound that breaks sky and salt and bone. A sound that means someone is finally coming home. The closer they got to the second lifeboat, the more surreal everything felt, because even though the ocean was still and the light golden from the setting sun, casting warm ripples across the waves, everyone on board the vessel could feel the weight of something unexplainable pressing down. Like the water itself was holding a secret, and as the drone's camera zoomed in on the floating shape, what it revealed sent a shiver through the crew. A boy, shirtless, sunburned, and more than 9 years old, sitting cross-legged in the middle of the boat, his arms wrapped tightly around a gray military blanket, and in his hands clenched. So tightly his knuckles were white was a waterproof photograph, the same one found floating in the debris near Alana Griggs's original wreck. The one showing a woman holding a newborn and a toddler with a German shepherd between them, and, as the rescue swimmer was lowered into the water, Odin growled softly, not in warning, but in anticipation. Eyes locked on the boy like a homing beacon had gone off inside him, and when the swimmer reached the boat and lifted the tarp, the boy flinched, blinked twice, then whispered one word, "Odin," and immediately reached toward the dog, waiting on the larger vessel as if he had been waiting for this moment. Not for hours, but for years, and when the boy was hoisted onto the deck, he didn't cry, didn't panic. He just reached out and placed his palm on Odin's head and whispered, Again. You came back, and Odin, who had been holding himself upright through pure will, collapsed. Not from defeat, but from release. His mission complete. His body finally allowing itself to rest, as the boy leaned over and buried his face in the dog's fur. In that moment, that quiet, weightless moment, made hardened military men step back and look away. Because there was something too real about it, too raw, like watching the ending of a story no one ever believed would find a page. Caleb, for that was his name, Caleb Griggs, son of Alana and brother to baby Isla, was taken below deck, hydrated, examined, but more importantly, listened to. Because when the doctors asked what happened, how he survived, how he ended up 200 miles from where they thought he was lost, he didn't offer panic or confusion. He told them calmly, "Odin told me where to go," and when they tried to clarify what he meant, he said he wasn't there, but I could hear him. At night, in the waves, in the boat. And when they asked about the lifeboat, he said it found me. After the storm, when Mama put us in the raft, it broke. Odin stayed with Isla. Mine came later, and no one knew what to make of it, because the boy wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't delusional. His vitals were stable, his speech was clear, and everything he said seemed to align with impossible truths to children surviving independently. Each found in a lifeboat not registered to any current Navy or civilian inventory. Each in possession of fragments that traced back to a woman long declared dead, and each under the guardianship guidance. Guidance and protection of a dog who should never have been there in the first place. And as Caleb recovered, and Isla continued to gain strength, something strange began to happen between the two siblings. Something no one could explain. When Isla cried, Caleb flinched. When Caleb shivered in his sleep, Isla's heart monitor spiked. When he drew pictures of the sea, she smiled in her sleep, and the doctors began monitoring them together. Curious, cautious, but increasingly aware that what they were witnessing wasn't just medical, it was connected, and Odin, though still weak, would move between their beds like a bridge, nuzzling one, then the other, then resting right between them as if guarding an invisible thread neither child could see, but both could feel. And then, on the fourth night after Caleb's rescue, something happened that no one could deny. Isla, who had not spoken a single word since arriving, sat upright in her sleep, looked toward the hallway and whispered, "He's coming," and moments later, a Navy officer walked in holding a sealed black box, retrieved from the seafloor hours earlier by an unmanned subdrone following the last coordinates Odin had stood and barked toward. And inside the box were two things: a sealed handwritten journal belonging to Alana Griggs and a pocket-sized digital voice recorder that had miraculously survived years underwater. And when they played the audio, the room went still, because the voice was unmistakable. It was Alana, and she was whispering calmly, like someone writing her final words, saying, "If anyone finds this, please tell my children they were never alone. Odin knows the way. Trust him. Follow the dog. He remembers everything," and the last few seconds of the recording were of a baby crying, a child laughing, and a single bark in the distance. And that night, as Emily watched over the children and Odin slept between them, she posted a photo to the internet, just one, no caption, of the dog curled between the two survivors, with the moonlight casting soft reflections on their beds. And by morning, the photo had been shared over 6 million times, triggering a wave of public emotion that swept through social media like a storm, with people writing things like dogs or angels. He didn't just protect them, he brought them home. Odin is proof loyalty has no limits. And where are you watching this from? And what time is it there? And in homes across the country, from truck stops in Texas to apartments in Brooklyn, people stayed up late just to talk about the story. To cry, to remember their own dogs, to believe, even if just for a moment, that maybe the world wasn't as broken as it sometimes felt. And as the media caught up and the Navy finally held a press conference, they didn't try to explain the physics, the timelines, or the mysteries. They simply showed the footage of Odin staring at the lifeboat. And the commander said, he never gave up. He kept them alive. He found us when we couldn't find him. And for that, we owe him more than words. And even as applause echoed through the crowd, Odin stayed asleep, his head resting on Caleb's leg, his tail curled toward Isla's blanket, his breathing steady, his mission complete, or so they thought. The days that followed were unlike anything the base had ever experienced. Not because of press conferences or security clearances or military protocol, all of which were stretched to their limits, but because of the strange, gentle stillness that seemed to settle over the medical wing. The kind of stillness you only feel after a storm has passed, and everyone is still counting their blessings one breath at a time. Because Caleb was healing faster than expected, his vitals strong, his appetite returning, his speech sharper each day, and Isla, once barely responsive, was now awake and giggling, gripping fingers, reaching for her brother, sleeping best when his voice was nearby. And the two of them, born years apart, now brought back together by fate, by love, and by a German shepherd who never once questioned the odds, were becoming whole again. And yet, in the quiet corners of the room, beneath all the joy and relief, was something heavier, something unspoken, because Odin, despite every effort, was fading, slowly, gently. Not in pain, not in fear, but like someone who knew his work was done, like a guardian clocking out after a lifetime of standing watch. And the medics did everything they could for fluids, supplements, warm baths, soft beds, but his body was old, his journey long, and the damage from weeks at sea too much to reverse. And though Caleb cried quietly when he realized it, Odin would nuzzle his hand, lick away the tears, and then turn to Isla and rest his head by her tiny feet, as if to say, "I'm still here even now." And when the day finally came, when the sun was setting low over the coastline, and the sky turned golden like the day of the second rescue, Odin took one final walk, slow and steady, out onto the base lawn where both children were waiting, and lay down between them, his breathing soft, his eyes half closed, his body wrapped in a handmade blanket sent by a child in Kansas who wrote, "For the bravest dog in the world." And as Caleb curled up beside him, and Isla clutched his tail, Odin let out one last exhale. Not a bark, not a whimper. Just a breath that carried decades of loyalty, of purpose, of love, and closed his eyes forever. And they buried him the next morning beneath a cedar tree facing the ocean, with a small plaque that read, "Odin." He found them, he staved them, he stayed. And no one spoke much at the ceremony, not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone knew no words could match what he had done, what he had given, what he had become to the children, to the family, to the world. And the story, Odin's story, didn't end there. Because the video of his final moments beside the children had been streamed across the country, shared by news anchors who wept on camera, by veterans who saw in him the spirit of every fallen brother, by mothers who held their children tighter. After watching, by thousands of strangers who wrote, "I believe in good again," and within weeks, a foundation was created in his name. The Odin Project focused on training service dogs for children with trauma. And the first dog graduated and was placed with a boy who hadn't spoken in a year, and when asked what he wanted to name him, the boy whispered Odin. And no one corrected him. And in the years that followed, Caleb and Isla grew up together, never again separated, always remembering the way the world felt when Odin was near. And every year on the anniversary of the rescue, they visited the cedar tree, placing 2 stones and a piece of driftwood at the base, a quiet tradition they never explained to anyone. Maybe the world moved on. Maybe the reporters found new headlines. The Navy went back to protocol, and the world forgot about 2 lifeboats in the middle of nowhere, but the people who knew, the ones who were there, never forgot, because they had seen what loyalty looked like in its purest form. They'd watched a dog cross the ocean with no map, no food, no direction. Only a promise made in silence to children too young to understand what it meant to be saved. And in the end, Odin wasn't just a hero. He was a legend, a guardian, a reminder that sometimes the bravest hearts don't beat beneath medals or uniforms, but beneath fur, beside tiny hands. And inside stories that never die. And now that you've heard his story, we want to hear yours. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it there? And has a dog ever changed your life the way Odin changed theirs?